Welcome to the No Quit Living podcast. Our primary objective is to motivate and inspire our listeners to never quit. The reality of life is simple. We all fall. We all fail. At times, we get knocked down. The question is, do we get back up? Are we stronger? Are we better prepared to attain the maximum of our potential? Thank you for joining our No Quit tribe. As you go for your greatness today, never quit. And remember, we rise by lifting others up. Welcome to episode number 377 of the No Quit Living podcast. I'm your host, Christopher J. Worth, and today's theme of the day is leadership. Our quote of the day comes to us from John Maxwell. A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. As we are finishing up 2022, as we head into 2023, if you are looking for something to hold you more accountable, either personally or professionally, we would love it if you took a look at our Clear Planner. You can head on over to theclearplanner.com. Think journal, calendar, planner, and a goal tracker all in one. Go take a look at theclearplanner.com. Thank you. I had so much fun recording today's podcast, and I know you'll really enjoy hearing what Jordan Montgomery has to say. Whether it's leadership, books, or morning routines, I know you will take something from Jordan. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Jordan, I'd like to welcome you to the No Quit Living podcast.
Chris, thanks for having me, man. Good to be here.
I appreciate it. So the first question we ask everybody is, are you ready to positively impact at least one person today?
Yeah, come on, man. Hey, I get to hang out with you today, which means I got some extra juice and some extra energy to go out and impact people.
As a man of faith, I know you know the term iron sharpens iron. So I believe it's an honor to be here to have you. I've been following a bunch of your stuff for a while. And before we started recording, we talked about a bunch of friends and guests we've had in common. So I'm excited about that, which leads me to the reason of our podcast, which is to motivate and inspire people to never give up. And I was curious if you yourself have either a no-quit story or a time in your life where you could have given up or given in, but you didn't.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to childhood, man. Because I think for all of us, we have these defining moments in our life, and we've said you're always one small moment away from a different life. There's these moments that kind of change the trajectory of our life or our journey. And man, I was in sixth grade, and I was sitting in Mrs. Allen's language arts class. And I remember Mrs. Allen asking the class if any of us would like to sign up for student council. And for whatever reason, the way that she said it and the opportunity that she described sounded really interesting to me. She said, you get to weigh in on some decisions related to the school and the student body. You can go to some leadership meetings, and you're going to have access to some special coaches and teachers and whatever. And so I just thought, wow, that sounds like something I'd like to be a part of. But the guys that I was sitting with, kind of the jock crowd, they were all like snickering, like, who would ever want to do that? And I thought, well, man, I want to do that. But I was kind of torn, right? Because I wanted to fit in with my buddies as a sixth grade boy. At the same time, I wanted to raise my hand and say, I'm interested. And in that moment, that small moment, Chris, I raised my hand and I said, I think I'd like to do that. And all my buddies laughed. And Mrs. Allen said, well, that's awesome. And then she pulled me aside afterwards. And a week later, I was the little sixth grade student council president. And I say all that to say this. That's where my leadership journey really started. It was a small decision in sixth grade. And then from sixth grade all the way through my senior year of high school, I was our class president. And I got to experience so much as a result of that. I mean, it gave me opportunities to speak and lead and weigh in and work with the team. And I got to meet people because of that. And, and I was always involved in sports. So I was a captain of our sports team. So I got to lead that way too. But student council exposed me to a different type of leadership. Back to your question about quitting, my friends gave me a hard time, not just when I said, hey, I want to do that, but the entire year, because I was having to skip out on stuff that they were a part of to go to these student council meetings. And I'm so glad, Chris, that I didn't, because God used every part of my sixth grade experience to shape my journey that he's still shaping today. And so, man, I think about that a lot, that little tiny decision that I made in sixth grade and how that changed my life. And I'm glad that under the persecution, I didn't cripple or falter, because God had a plan, and and he carried me through. And so there's a lot of no quit stories, but that's one that comes to the front of my mind.
That's a really, really interesting story in many ways. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but I believe it's Ed Milet, or I've definitely heard it on his podcast, but I think he talks about quite often about you're one decision away from an entirely different life. And not to point out every single decision we've ever made, but going back to that decision, it led to obviously other decisions. And when you were in sixth grade, you had no idea that you'd be doing exactly what you're doing today. If you did, you'd be a mind reader and probably, worth $10-20 billion. But it's those dominoes effects that all of a sudden this decision leads to something else. And I don't know if as a sixth grade boy myself, I would have been able to raise my hand because I was definitely interested in some of those things. But candidly, I probably would have just kept my hand down and then after class gone up to the teacher and be like, hey, I'm really interested, but can I do this without any of my buddies knowing? Just because as a sixth grade boy, like you said, you want to fit in more so than you want to stand out.
Yeah, that's so true, man. And it, here's connecting the dots though, is like, I can put my finger on that decision in sixth grade, but there's something that I'm going to talk about 10 and 20 years from now that I'm making a decision about today. So I think it's important for us to just remember, like, we're still that sixth grade boy, and we're still raising our hand to stuff, and we're still saying yes to stuff, and we're still being asked to move in certain directions and make decisions on stuff that will be hugely impactful for the rest of our life. And so I just never want to forget that, that God continues to put us in those positions.
That was super, super powerful. And the simplicity is a decision today. It impacts 10 to 20 years down the road. A fun question I ask each guest, and I'm interested to get your answers. If you had to define yourself, but you could only pick one word, what word did you pick?
Caring. Just pick the word caring. I think from the time I was really young, and sometimes to my detriment, I would care too much about what somebody thought or how they felt. But I feel like God's just put a spirit of caring on my life. And I've been able to maybe see some things that not everybody sees about people who are hurting or going through tough stuff. And so, yeah, I'd use the word caring.
I think it's such a powerful word. And I think if you want to pack it for a second, obviously you can care about others, care for others. But I think you touched on it too, is if you care too much about some of those things that don't really matter. And I think that goes along to kind of the social media world we're in today, where we care too much about likes and follows and things like that than we do, and excuse me, from strangers, people we don't know. I think sometimes then the important moments of people that you do care about that are literally maybe right in front of you or next to you. But I love that word caring, because like I said, I think it's got two sides to it.
Yeah, I think the challenge is, as you get older and you mature, is to care about the right stuff, and having some wisdom and discernment about when it makes sense to care and go deeper. And so for me right now, that's with our kids and in my marriage, I've got to prioritize and care more about those things than I do, anything else. So you're right. There's two sides to that.
I like that. We've dissected the morning routine the last probably 2 years on this podcast. And I almost feel like I have a MBA or a PhD in not being a perfectionist in morning routines, but just hearing from so many people. And I was curious if you have a morning routine that you swear by.
Yeah. First off, in the personal development space, you hear from a lot of people that say, I wake up at 4 a.m., I read my vision for an hour, and then I drink 10 cups of water, and then I work out for, and it's like every time I'm like, man, I don't know that you really do that. Right. So I say all that to say this. I think we got to give ourselves grace, and if somebody's listening and you got young kids, maybe you're in charge of leading a business. Life is just unpredictable, and every day's different. Every day's a blessing, and different things come at us. And so part of it is, I would say, just give yourself grace with routine. I'm huge on routine. I'm huge on habit. I'm not minimizing the importance of habit or routine, but I think sometimes we do people a disservice in the personal development space when we hold ourselves out as these people who always get it right and always do the same thing. And we leave people feeling like, well, gosh, I really must be screwed up if I can't even do that 2 days a week. So hear me loud and clear before I mention routine, that I am not perfect at this every day, and I need grace. And we got kids and life is crazy. But for me, morning routine is typically waking up at 5 a.m. So that's when the alarm goes off. So I'm out of bed at 5. I want to start by winning the inner game. Robin Sharma said everything happens twice, first in the mind, then in reality. For so much of my life, I would immediately play the outer game. The outer game is strategy, tactics, concepts, communication. It's that, right? It's for me, I would go to email and text, and I'd start checking in with people and checking out what was happening in the world, go to social media. So that's the outer game. The inner game is vision, prayer, meditation, clarity. So for me, it's quiet time. It's just me with me. Sometimes it's getting into the word. Sometimes it's just sitting alone with God. Sometimes it's a little bit of time and thought. Sometimes it's 5 minutes. Sometimes it's 30 minutes. Again, every day can be a little bit different. And then it's really plugging in with the people I care about most. So it's our children, my wife. I've got to be present in those morning hours. When I travel, that looks different. But if I'm home, man, 7 to 8 o'clock is like sacred time in our house. So I play the inner game. I will get a little bit caught up on some work stuff, kind of set the day. So if I need to respond to some important communication, I'll do that. And then, man, our kids are running around the house like crazy at 7 a.m. I want to be present from 7 to 8. I typically don't have meetings during that time. And I don't work out in the morning. I work out in the afternoon. It's just when I feel like I'm at my best. But I'm all for people who want to work out in the morning. I do believe that physiology affects psychology. The way that your body moves affects the way that your mind thinks. And so not against that. It's just not what's worked for me. And then typically after kids go to school, there's 30 minutes of growth and development. So I'm listening to a podcast. I'm reading a book. Again, getting ready for the day. So much of what I do is speak and coach, just like you, Chris. And so you know this better than anybody, that what comes into your mind comes out in your life. And if you got anything to give, man, you got to be drinking some good books, listening to good podcasts, and growing the mind. So those are 4 things: win the inner game, catch up on important communication, plug in with the people I love most, and then sharpen my mind. Those 4 things happen in my morning. It's usually a pretty good morning.
There's so much within what you just said that I want to dissect and go into, but I just want to touch on a couple things. I love what you said in regards to not being perfect and different times in your life you do different things, and that to me has been one of the biggest things that I've tried to get better at. Last week I was working with a couple college sports teams, and I didn't quote unquote have the same morning. I was in a hotel. I was traveling to and from campus, going to the weight room, to the classrooms. And the old me would have had that phobia of like, okay, it needs to be perfect. But I think what you said is so important. And I would challenge our listeners to almost go back and re-listen to what Jordan just said, because it's not about being perfect, but it's also about finding what works for you. And then I do want to touch on one thing you said that I really, really like, is you said the personal development space. You said that 2 times. And I think so many people call this space the self-help world. And I just don't like that terminology, because I think help and I need help and want help it's just got a negative spin to it. But I love the personal development. I talk about personal growth, all those type of things. And I just think it's really powerful, because some of the most amazing people I've had the honor of having on the show, they talk about those type of things. And you said what comes in your mind comes out in your life. And I've heard different variations of that, but that is so powerful. And I think going back to what you said about not picking up the phone and responding to things, I've heard it said many times, and I wanted to get your 2 cents on this. Is, to me, that's the idea of being reactive versus proactive. And I think the people that are proactive throughout their morning, they have a better chance of winning their day, winning their afternoon, and ultimately, winning the next day as well.
Yeah, well, what you do daily establishes who you become permanently, and so I do believe that winners value the process of winning. And the process starts with what we do first thing in the morning, it also starts with what we do the night before. In the personal development world, the sexy thing to talk about is what time your alarm goes off. Everybody wants to talk about when they get up, but you can't get up at a good time if you don't go to bed at the right time. And we live in a culture, Chris, and you know this better than anybody. We live in a culture that's obsessed with diet and exercise. So if you Google diet plan, exercise plan, thousands of hits, right? But what's interesting is what's more important to our health and productivity than diet and exercise put together is sleep. And we have a bunch of people giving up sleep to go exercise. And so back to preparation and routine, I think what you do daily matters. And I also think what you do in the morning matters. But the most important decision that we make, I believe, from a personal development standpoint, is when we go to bed and how much sleep we choose to get. We spend a third of our life sleeping. And nobody talks about sleeping well. You don't listen to many podcasts where it's like, today we're talking about sleep and rest. Conversely, we talk about dominating, getting after it, making, the moments count. And so, man, I just encourage people, man, think about how you rest and recover, because it's a critical part of living a healthy, productive lifestyle.
My next podcast episode is 100% going to be about sleep. We're going to just sleep during the podcast. No, I think that's awesome. And I have both Apple Watch and the Whoop Band. And one of the things that I've been trying to get better at, and I'm far from good at it, is my sleep and my recovery. And I know for a fact, because I'm a morning workout guy, the mornings when I walk to the gym and you're sluggish and you don't feel rested, it takes an extra 5-10 minutes. And those are the days usually where you don't get as good of a workout in. And that's the same thing, obviously, with athletes and even just people that are trying to have the best day that they have. It's so important. You mentioned during your morning routine reading. Was curious if you've read anything recently or you're currently reading something that you'd like to recommend to our listeners.
Yeah, there's a book called In a Pit with a Lion on a Snowy Day. Mark Batterson. I'm a big Mark Batterson fan. I think Mark's work is just dynamite. He also wrote a book called The Circle Maker. And, that book's all about prayer. In a Pit with a Lion on a Snowy Day is really about battling adversity. So that's a book that I've been reading recently. I like to go back to books that I've already read. Probably my favorite book in the personal development space. This changes from time to time. Depends on the season I'm in. We coach and teach a lot of salespeople. And so when I think about it from that standpoint, Go Givers Sell More by Bob Berg is just one of my favorite all-time books. So I just reread that. So between that and In a Pit with a Lion on a Snowy Day, two books that I've read recently, both dynamite reads that I'd recommend to any listener.
Two fantastic books, and I've had the chance and the fortune of having both Mark and Bob on the podcast, and just fantastic guys that I think truly understand the concept of relationships, but also just the way in which they teach, coach, and write, for me, stands out a lot. You mentioned something that a couple guests probably within the last year and a half have spoken about, which is rereading a book. And I remember the old me would almost, check the box and then put the book on the shelf, and it was like, okay, I won. And then a lot of guests had talked about, oh, I reread this, or I've started rereading books. I had one guest a few years back that he reads Think and Grow Rich every year on his birthday. And I remember taking notes, and I was like, well, why would you do that? And so many people talk about the value of it. So just have to ask real quick if you could just touch on that, touch on the value of reading or rereading a book, and more importantly, what you've taken from it.
Two thoughts. What do I need to do, and what do I need to share? Those are like the two thoughts that I'm having as I reread. There's this idea that knowledge is power, and I think that's not necessarily true. Knowledge is power when it's applied. And what I'm learning is, like you, Chris, I've read a book, I enjoyed it, and then I put it on the shelf and I forgot to apply, or I just didn't apply as much as I could have. And so for me, the reread is all about application. It's about what I need to do and what I need to share. And what I mean by what I need to share is, who am I going to share the book with? Who do I need to share the content with? Who needs that kind of hope or message or data or input? Because I didn't read the book just for me. I'm reading that book so that I can be a vessel and a blessing to others. That's the work that you do. That's the work that I do as a coach, as a keynote speaker, as somebody who transmits information. I'm always trying to think about, okay, what does our audience need? What do our stakeholders need? And how can we use this content to impact them? Anything you want to add to that? I mean, you're obviously doing the same thing. So what do you think about when you think about that?
I would just take it one step further, where I've found, and would love to get your 2 cents on this, is when I read a book, the same book, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 years later, I'm in a different season of my life. And it doesn't have to be something crazy as, reading it when you're 20 and then when you're 40, but it could be literally a year or a year and a half or 2 years later. I've just found that I've taken different things from it. And that, to me, it's almost like in some ways I'm reading a new book. I'm a avid reader myself. So that's like that other, sides of the coin where like, oh, like this is different. But then, you realize that no, like it's not a different book. It's the same thing. But it's for me, being in a quote unquote different season, some things stand out really differently. And you're like, oh, wow.
Yeah, you do. You see new things and you read new things, even though it's the same book. Somehow you read something new, or you interpret it or hear it in a different way. So, I've heard it said that people need to hear something 7 or 8 times before it sticks. My friend Craig Rochelle said, just because you said it doesn't mean that people heard it, believe it, or will do it. And so if that's true in verbal communication, I think it's also true in written communication. Just because you read it doesn't mean that you really heard it, believe it, or will do it. So we got to go back to the reread.
I love that. And I believe Zig Ziglar said that he recommended to watch a video or listen to an audio 7 times, because that's when you really get it. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, come on, Zig, I can't read it or listen to an audiobook or a podcast 7 times.
Well, hey, let's stay on this for a second, because this is an important point. I think as leaders, as a coach, you're a coach. And when I say leader, anybody who has any level of influence. So if you're listening and you have influence, you're a leader. Let's remember this as we lead and teach and train and equip. People need to be reminded more than they need to be instructed. And I think our tendency is to want to bring something new and sexy and fresh. Just like when we read, our tendency is, man, I want to say I read this book and put it on a shelf, and then get into the new book and then put that one on the shelf. And I want to be able to say that I've read 20 books. But it's really not about what you read. It's about what you remember. And so as we absorb, but also as we teach, let's remember that our job is not to bring the new stuff. Our job is to bring the stuff that's true and right and worthy. I think about the life of Jesus. He said 3 things over and over and over again. He said, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. And that's really all he ever said. I mean, he said it in different ways, but that was his ministry. So I think the best pastors, the best teachers, the best parents, the best coaches, they just remind people over and over and over and over of what they know to be true. And they're not just the CEO, they're the CRO, they're the chief reminding officer. Great leaders stay on topic, and they remind people over and over and over of what they know to be true. You agree with that?
I agree 100%. And I wanted to, it totally made me think about something that I wanted to get your perspective. I've gone through a bunch of different coaching programs for speaking and writing and podcasting, and I always try to learn. But one of the speaking courses, the gentleman said, in a great speech, you tell the audience what you're going to tell them, then you tell them that, and then at the end, you tell them what you told them. And I remember the first time I'm taking notes and I'm writing down, and I'm like, all right, so you tell them. And he said, what happens is people don't always remember something the first time. Or sometimes they'll remember back, what was that? That guy Jordan was talking about something. And he just broke it down in its simplest form. He said, you tell the audience what you're going to tell them. Then you go ahead and tell them. And then as you're wrapping up in your conclusion, you touch on what you told them. And that's how again, it went on and on. But that was my biggest takeaway. And I'm curious if you agree with that in the perspective of just what you shared about the reminding people.
Love that adage. Totally agree with it. And if you study great orators, that's what they do. So like if you go to YouTube, one of the people I love to study who's become a friend is John Maxwell. And I was giving John a hard time the other day. I said, man, we're talking about you because what we all know about John is whether you like him, love him, don't like him, what you can't argue is that he's one of the most quoted Americans of our time. Certainly one of the most quoted leaders, but certainly one of the most quoted Americans. So the point is this: people remember what he says. They don't just hear it, they remember it. Why do they remember it? Because if you listen to a John Maxwell 40-minute keynote speech, roughly he'll speak for 40 to 45 minutes, he will repeat the central theme of his message about 35 to 40 times. People hear that and they're like, there's no way. Go study, pull up YouTube, study a John Maxwell. He will say the same. Now, he says it in a slightly different way. He'll kind of circle back to it and say it in different ways. But he will repeat himself over and over and over again. What John knows is that people need to hear something 7 or 8 times before it sticks. And just because he said it doesn't mean that they heard it, believe it, or will do it. So he's trained himself to be the CRO, stay on topic. And he's more focused on reminding people of what they already know versus I got to bring something sexy, fresh, and new. And I think that's part of what makes him one of the top orators of our time.
Well, I don't share this much with my audience, but I actually got and went through the first ever John Maxwell certification program back in 2011. He's had, I believe, at least 2 or 3 every single year. So I got a chance to spend about 3.5 days with him. And it was a small group. I think there was about 400 of us. Now they have up to 1,000, 1,500 people. And I didn't know it at the time. I think I've shared the story once before, but when we signed up for it, there were so many different payment options, and I didn't know that there were. So I just put the whole balance on my credit card. And then the next day I got an email from somebody on John's team, and they said, make sure, you're ready for your dinner. And I just responded, I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, the first 10 people that paid in full, which you were one of them, you get a chance to go to John's house and just spend about an hour or 2 with John. And that was an amazing, amazing time. And that night and those couple of days just really fired me up. And I was obviously already excited about that. But John is such an amazing person. And speaking about leadership, you put out a video a couple of days ago, I believe, might have been a little bit earlier than that, but in regards to servant leadership and Patrick Lencioni. And I wanted to ask if you could just touch on that for a second, because I was watching it. And first of all, I love Patrick's books. His last book is awesome. But when I was listening to you talk about that, and I forget who you were talking to, it just hit me because it's so powerful. And to me, there's no difference between leadership and servant leadership. So I would love if you wouldn't mind just touching on that for a minute.
Yeah, well, it gets back to me to the life of Jesus. So again, whether you believe in Jesus, don't believe in Jesus, most people would say whether you believe in him as the Son of God, you believe that he existed. So what do we know about Jesus? Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And he humbled himself as a servant. So my opinion, Chris, is that Jesus is the most impactful leader that ever walked planet Earth. And he chose to consider other people ahead of himself. And as a result, he had radical influence and impact. So people use the term servant leader, or they'll say servant leadership. And yeah, Pat Lencioni said this. He said, it always confuses me when people say that, because leadership is service. Service is leadership. The most impactful leader to ever walk planet Earth came to serve and to be served. And when you break down leadership, it's leading by example. It's thinking of others ahead of yourself. It's realizing that the personal economics don't have to make sense. It's caring in a really deep and authentic way. I mean, all of that is service. So the reason Pat says he's frustrated is saying servant leadership insinuates that there's another way to do it. It's like, well, what other type of leadership is there? Because I thought I thought leadership is service and service is leadership. So yeah, we took that from Pat Lencioni, and I just couldn't agree more with Pat's sentiments, on that topic.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing for me too is for me, when I look at or identify the best leaders or people that I think are true leaders, by default, they are all people that are amazing at serving others, whether it's helping them financially, with business, personally, professionally, faith, whatever it is. The best leaders in my definition, are the best people that serve as well. So I'm glad you touched on that. I know you know the famous quote by Jim Rohn: "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." If I could grant you dinner with any 5 people, dead or alive, that you could level up with, who would you pick?
Oh man. All right. Well, you're putting me on the spot. So if I had more time to think about it, the list might look slightly different. Dead or alive, my grandpa would be at the dinner table. My grandpa is one of the wisest men that I ever knew, and he passed on a few years back, so he's no longer with us. But I'd want grandpa there. I'd want my dad there. I think I'd want my wife there to experience that with me. So now I got 3 out of the 5 spots taken up by my wife, my dad, and my grandpa. Dead or alive, man, I'm going back to Jesus, most impactful leader to ever walk planet Earth. I'd want him at that table. And then with the 5th one, man, I might go like in a different direction. Man, I'd like to go back. I would love to have a conversation with Martin Luther King. I'd love to know what was going through his mind in those years and in the fine moments of his leadership journey. Like, to me, he's one of the greats. I mean, I think Jesus is obviously in his own category, but Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, like, I'd want a leader like that at the table that stood for something and fought on the front line for what they believed in. So those are my 5.
That is a great list. So I've never done this before. We're almost 400 episodes in. This is the first time I'm asking a follow-up 5 questions. So because you're a guy that speaks a lot and clearly understands the value and the importance of leadership, if I had to ask you that same question, except now you have the 5 of the top leadership people that you'd like to have dinner with that have to be sports related, who would you pick in that 5?
Oh man, this is fun. So sports related, I want MJ at that table.
Yes.
Just because he's, fascinating to me. I'd probably want Peyton Manning there for no other reason than he'd make the dinner funny.
I was just, not to cut you off, I was just about to say, regardless of whether you like him or not, I think he was funny back then. Obviously, you don't just all of a sudden at the age of 40, whatever, become funny. But I think he's hilarious in so many ways.
He's a hoot, man. So got to have Peyton there just to kind of mix it up. I probably would want Kobe there. I'd want to hear Kobe talk to MJ. That'd be fun to hear those two kind of duke it out. I'd want Pat McAfee at the table. For the same reason I'd want Peyton at the table. It would just be way more entertaining. So Pat McAfee, Peyton Manning, Michael Jordan. That's a unique table of people. Kobe Bryant, and I might say so I'm in Iowa. I'm a diehard Hawkeye, right? I grew up in Iowa, and so one of the Iowa coaches, like Fran McCaffrey's a good friend of mine, and I'd want some Iowa representation at the table. So I'd probably bring him with me. A Fran McCaffrey, Kirk Ferentz. I'll bring one of those guys with me.
That is awesome. So we'll switch lanes here for a second to what we call our hot seat questions. And the only thing that we ask you is you spit out the first thing that comes to mind.
Love it. Let's do it.
Last meal, you can pick absolutely anything. What do you pick?
Mexican, like a steak quesadilla.
Favorite smell?
Summer breeze, like open windows in the house and like on a summer night. That smell.
Favorite sport?
Boy, it's tied between football and basketball. They're like equal for me.
Favorite team?
Growing up in Iowa, man, it's got to be the Hawks. Iowa Hawkeyes. I'm probably more of a college. I'm diehard pro. I love sports, but but I would say the Hawks and the Green Bay Packers.
All-time favorite book?
Bible.
Do you have an all-time favorite movie?
Remember the Titans.
Great flick. What's the favorite app you use on your phone?
The honest answer? The one I'm on the most? Hey, it's the reason we met, man. Instagram.
All right, what's the non-honest answer?
Blinkist. Blinkist is a great app, condenses books.
What's the background picture on your phone?
It is it's actually a saying. It's 250 workouts, 500 hours of content. It says most important job. It's a reminder my most important job is to be a child of God, a father, and a husband. And then it just reminds me I need to get my workouts in and I need to be developing my mind.
That's awesome. Do you have an all-time favorite quote?
Yeah, I love this quote. Craig Rochelle said, "Your life is always moving in the direction of your strongest thoughts."
That's a powerful quote. And what's that song, no matter whenever you hear it, at 5 a.m. or 10 p.m., you just automatically turn it up and rock out to it?
Back in Black by AC/DC.
So I'm definitely excited to get this answer. We talked a little bit about social media, but wanted to ask you if there are one or two people that really put out great content, uplifting stuff that you'd maybe like to share with our listeners or potentially introduce to our listeners.
Yeah, I'm just going to go rapid fire short list because there's a bunch of them. David Nurse is one of the best encouragers I've ever met in my entire life. David Nurse, he's David Nurse MBA on Instagram. Eric Wood, our mutual friend. Ewood70 on Instagram. Sad that I know those handles off the top of my head, by the way. John Gordon. Let's see if I can keep doing this. I think he's John Gordon 11.
He is.
Is he? Right. I love a lot of the stuff that Brene Brown does on vulnerability and courage. I don't know Brene, but I love her content.
She's my
love John, but I feel like everybody's following John. Alan Stein Jr., man. I love Alan. Go follow Alan. We both know Alan. He's such a great person. And then, hey, one that people need to know, Ryan Leak, Leak. Do you know Ryan?
Yeah, he was on the show. I literally just got his new book this week. I haven't started yet, but I'm excited to read it.
He's amazing, man. Talk about authentic, practical. He's probably one of the top keynote speakers in America right now. And so if you're not following Ryan Leak, go check him out. Leadership guru, person of faith. He's the man.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you didn't take anything from this podcast, take that Jordan not only is an unbelievable guy, but if you need to know any Instagram handle, just reach out to him. He knows them all. So what's the best way for our listeners to find out more about you, find out more about what you do, but more importantly, those that want to connect with you or maybe see about hiring you or bringing you in to talk to their team or company? What's the best way for them to find all that stuff?
Yeah, our website is montgomerycompanies.com. So go to montgomerycompanies.com or Instagram is where we do a lot. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. I'm Jordan M. Montgomery on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. I'd also say this, Chris, if anybody has a question or a thought, like if you want to reach out, we respond to every DM. So throw us a question, throw us a thought. We'll get back to you. We'd love to add value and just be of service to anybody listening today.
Awesome. And then last question we have for you, same question we ask everybody, is if you have any parting words you'd like to leave with our listeners today.
I do have some parting words. And here's what I'll say. In all the podcasts that we've ever done, or that I've been fortunate enough to be on, you are maybe the most dialed in, thoughtful host. Like 400 episodes is an insane amount of podcasting. And you can tell, man, it shows up in your, I love that quote about success is the natural consequence of applying the basics and the fundamentals. And the great ones never get bored with the basics or take the fundamentals for granted. And the fundamentals of podcasting, like making it about others, asking insightful questions, the tonality, the pace, the rhythm, cadence, dude, you have perfected this craft. And so just want to give you a shout out, man. If you're not already subscribed to the No Quit Living podcast, get on it. I just feel honored to be on a podcast that's featured so many top thought leaders and speakers, and you're really gifted in this space, man. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Listen, I truly, truly appreciate that. That means so much coming from you. And to our listeners out there, Jordan shared some awesome stuff. If you are not following him, if you are not listening to and getting his content, then make sure you do that as well. But I truly appreciate it, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah, look forward to it, Chris. We'll definitely have more discussion in the future. And man, blessing to be with you today for sure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to episode number 377. Jordan touched upon some key points today. I really enjoyed what he shared with us today in regard to his morning routine and what works for him. As we're heading into 2023, I would like to challenge each of you to think about your morning routine and perhaps how you might be able to tweak it to make 2023 your best year. And if you don't have a morning routine, why not start one for 2023? And remember, we rise by lifting others up.